Okay, so that we have this presentation recorded, I did that. All right, so your board of directors, we have repeater chair who you just heard from is Mark, KF6WTN. Your scope editor is Keith, KM6CXW, who would love content. I don't see him on, but if you have any content for the scope, send it to scope@palomararc.org. Including pictures of your shack, pictures of your mobile installation, APRS, satellite rigs, whatever. Anything that you learned tonight on satellite, put it to use and send us an article about it. Doesn't have to be fancy. Director Ron, AJ6FQ. The other director has been promoted to vice president. We'll get to that in a moment, but we are currently looking at options for filling that second director position. Membership Chair Glenn, AI6RR, who you heard from earlier. Treasurer Jim, K2VO. Secretary Other Jim, W6TQS. Vice President is Chris, KD9LF, who was your other director. And I am Joe, K6JPE, your president. And I will now turn it over to our presenter for the evening. Take it away, Pat.
Good evening. Can I share my screen on there?
I thought I enabled that. Yeah, you should be able to.
Let me get everything. Let's try this. Okay. Looks like it's coming up there. I have a little sidebar with some of the cameras, and it looks like my opening slide is there.
We do see
just
that
with
opening slide.
Your logo and today's date. Good evening, and I got to thank Michelle Thompson and Chris, who we've been chatting about doing the presentation at tonight's meeting. It was sort of a quick little advance notice, but that's okay. It seems like I've been doing a lot of these video presentations over the last couple of years. My name is Patrick Stoddard, like the screen shows. I'm WD9EWK over here in Scottsdale. Would have liked to come over there to give a presentation in person. Like I was saying before the meeting started, maybe I'm going to do something about that in the future, especially if fuel prices come back down. I've been licensed since 1977. Been working satellites since the mid-2000s after living in places with either HOAs or I could put up an antenna, but the neighborhood probably wasn't a good place to put up an antenna and advertise that I have radios in the house or the apartment. So a lot of what I'll be talking about here, this is stuff I'll do here at home, just like I would operating away from home. For those who are just getting licensed or just recently licensed, amateur radio satellites are available to anyone that has a technician, general, or extra class license. Most of our activities are on 2 meters and 70 centimeters. So dual band radios, handhelds, mobiles can be pressed into service to work satellites. Quick history lesson, and I won't dwell on it too long. The space age started with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik 1 in 1957, beeping around the world for a few months before it re-entered. They were the first to put a satellite into orbit. The US followed a few months later, but amateur radio actually wasn't too far behind in relative terms. Mostly on the West Coast after Sputnik in the late 50s, there was an effort to build an amateur radio satellite and get it launched. Not that anybody outside of the US and the Soviet governments had been launching anything. The picture here is of one of the builders of Oscar 1, the first amateur radio satellite. Lance Jenner, K6GSJ, is still alive and kicking. He gave a nice talk about a decade ago in San Jose on building and some history around the launch of the satellite. It was built mostly in a West Coast effort and launched from Vandenberg in December 1961. So a little more than 4 years after Sputnik went up, Oscar 1 was launched from Vandenberg. It was launched with another satellite at the time, was just called a scientific satellite, Discoverer 36. Oscar 1 beat Telstar, the communication satellite, to orbit by a few months. And in doing so, it was the first time 2 satellites were launched at once. That's a common thing now, where the CubeSats are being launched dozens at a time. Starlink, they're putting up a few dozen with every launch. But in 1961, this was a new concept. The Air Force gave the Project Oscar guys on the West Coast parameters. The satellite had to fit in the side of the launcher, and that's why the top of the satellite is actually curved, because it was facing out of the launch vehicle, on the edge of the launch vehicle. Only transmitted for a few couple weeks, but it showed that amateur radio operators could build and launch satellites, and we still do that to this day. In the 90s, Lance Jenner mentioned that Discoverer 36 was not a scientific research satellite, it was a spy satellite, but they were sworn to secrecy about that at the time, and he had said that it wasn't until, I think it was the late 1990s, before he and others were told they could actually talk a little more about that satellite. Many years ago, I had actually looked into working satellites in the 80s and 90s, and on a college student's budget, it wasn't possible for me. If I had money that I could have used to build a station, I wanted a car, or a better car. And you usually needed a couple of radios, a transmitter and a receiver, to be able to work the satellites of the day. And as the satellite-ready transceivers started showing up on the market, those were really expensive. Most of the satellite operating was single sideband or CW, and maybe some slow scan TV and teletype thrown in. We did have satellites in low and high orbits back then, but there wasn't really an easy, inexpensive way to try it out. I probably would have enjoyed it, but like I said, to get that sort of money, and I had estimated it would be $2,000 to $3,000 around 1990, 91 if I wanted a satellite station. That I wasn't ready to drop that much money on radios. Like any other part of ham radio, satellite operators work for wallpaper, worked all states, VUCC, DXCC, just like any other facet of the hobby. If there's an award, there are hams willing to go after it. Compared to today, where we have more options for radios, there are radios with satellite functionality built into them. For example, the current IC 9700 from ICOM is designed in part for satellite operation. All mode radios, there are people who will use even the old IC 706s from the mid to late 90s and radios like that to put together a station to work satellites. Software-defined radios, especially the receivers, are very popular. For FM satellites, most of us probably have dual band handheld radio. That's the starting point for many, if not most, these days to get on the satellites. For the most part, our satellites now are in lower orbits, within a few hundred miles of the surface. The exception being the Europeans, Africans, toward the Middle East. They have a payload called QO100 that's on a Qatari communication satellite in geostationary orbit. The footprint does not reach the continental US. You would have to go to the eastern tip of Brazil, Africa, Europe, much of Asia over towards Southeast Asia to be able to use that satellite. And like in the past, awards are a popular item among satellite operators. So worked all states, VUCC. from the Western US, if you started today, DXCC just isn't possible. You could get to about 70 to 75 countries. But if you were east of the Mississippi or certainly closer to the East Coast, between stations throughout much of South America and Europe, you could work DXCC. And there are a few guys from the northeastern US who have achieved DXCC without a high orbit satellite. In terms of getting started, these are a couple of pictures showing what could be the smallest example of a workable satellite station for our FM satellites, a dual band handheld radio. In this case, it's one of the Chinese brand dual band handheld radios. And I put a long flexible whip on the radio, a dual band whip. And I've had an earphone plugged in, an audio recorder, so I didn't have to write down or try to remember who I worked on the past. But this is probably, a minimalist way of getting on satellites. And I did this through AO91, which, by the way, this is an actual size model. AO91 is a 4-inch, or if you prefer, 10-centimeter CubeSat satellite that was launched a few years ago, and is still operational in daylight. Another example, this is going in a slightly different direction. Instead of buying the antenna is homemade. It's a dual band Yagi, similar to what Arrow Antennas sells at HRO and other places. The radio is a red-cased Baofeng dual band handheld. This picture came from a ham I worked down in southern Mexico a couple years ago. He had told me that in Mexico, the Baofengs are more like $50 to $60 US, the equivalent of that. The antenna he built out of parts, maybe $10 or so in parts. But it was a workable way to get on satellites without a lot of money. I'm using a slightly different form of that station, and this was at a demonstration in Yuma at the Hamfest there a couple years ago. I'm holding a Kenwood THD72, which is the now discontinued dual band handheld that included packet and APRS, while holding an Elk dual band log periodic outside the main hall at the Hamfest in Yuma. I had a loudspeaker plugged into it and set a few feet away from me so the crowd could hear the satellite without causing audio feedback while I was transmitting. Nice place to do a demonstration out there. I was asked by Chris to put some examples of what I typically use working satellites. The picture there, that's one configuration that I'll use even at home at times. I'll just take the handheld radio and the antenna outside and make some contacts on the satellite. I don't have any antennas on my house. I'm not in an HOA neighborhood. It's an older neighborhood, but I just haven't put anything up on the house or in the backyard. So my setups are very portable even at home. And this was just a few weeks ago. I had set up to work satellites in single sideband and FM. And I used a trash bin. I wheeled it out in front of the car and set up 2 radios on the roof of the car for my single sideband setup. The FM setup was a dual band mobile radio, ICOM's ID 5100. I wasn't using it in D-Star, just in FM to work satellites. The antenna was that elk log periodic that I had a couple pictures back. I also was working satellites in single sideband, and for that setup, I used a Yaesu FT817 as my transmitter, and the receiver was a separate radio. It was the ICOM ICR30. It's a wideband all-mode receiver. There are lots of options to set up something like this. This is a little more complicated, but it's a very portable setup as both radios have their own battery packs. I hold the antenna and I can record through the receiver or hook up a small audio recorder so I don't have to write anything down during a pass. And probably the most complex station I have at home, I'll use the Yaesu FT817 as my transmit radio. On the center of the trash bin is an 8-inch Windows 10 tablet running SDR software called HD SDR. And there's a black box toward the right of the lid on the trash bin. That's an SDR Play RSP1 receiver. This setup would let me work satellites in FM, single sideband, CW. I suppose I could put software on the tablet, and I could even do some digital modes through the radio. This is a, I went this way because a laptop was a little bigger than I wanted to set up in the backyard, and I just wanted to see if I could make one of those small tablets that came out a few years ago run software, sufficiently to do SDR work, and this one did. I couldn't run multiple programs at once on that tablet without bogging it down, but this was a viable setup to work different satellites without having a full station in the house. In terms of our satellites, at this point, I'm going to focus on the satellites that you can use with FM handheld radios, mobile radios, or all mode radios that include FM. We have a fair number of satellites that are available. The first one on this part of the list is AO27. It's been in orbit almost 30 years, transmit on 2 meters, listen on 70 centimeters. It was originally designed to relay data. And it just happened to be, it was built a few years before ICOM started bringing D-Star radios on the market, but AO27 will relay D-Star signals, not as a repeater, but just as a receiver tied to a transmitter that can handle data. And I've made dozens of contacts using D-Star through AO27. As far as I'm aware, the other digital modes haven't been used for satellite contacts, although I read recently that the open source M17 project was able to send M17 signals through that geostationary satellite QO100 not too long ago. AO91, that's what this is a model of. This is one of the AMSAT CubeSats that went up a few years ago. AO91 has some battery issues, but it works well during the daylight. AMSAT asks that you don't use it at night when the solar panels aren't getting any sunlight. IO86 was launched by a group in Indonesia. Unless you're in South Texas or South Florida, it's probably not going to be audible where you are in San Diego, and certainly not where I am in the Phoenix area, but the ISS definitely is. 2 meters up, 70 centimeters down. It is probably the strongest signal from an amateur satellite or payload in orbit. It transmits at about 5 watts, where AO91 transmits at half a watt, 500 milliwatts. Traditionally, the ISS radio would alternate between voice and packet, but the Russians now have a new dual band Kenwood radio on their side of the station, like the Europeans have had for the last couple of years. So we are almost to the point where the FM repeater will be operational full time, and separately a packet digipeater will be operating on 145.825. That hasn't been set up yet, but that may happen in the next few weeks. A few other satellites. Lilac Sat-2 is a popular one, mainly because people hope it's been turned on when it passes over the continental US on afternoons. There's no schedule to it. It's just a matter of find when it's on, go outside, and hope you hear more than telemetry coming down. PO101 was launched by the Philippines. It originally had a very limited schedule for users in North America, but it's on almost every day now, day and night. And SO50 has been in orbit about 20 years, 2 meters up and 70 centimeters down. It was the first of our satellites to require PL tones. To talk through the satellite, you use the 67 hertz tone, the lowest PL tone or CTCSS tone on your radio. But to turn it on, you would transmit for a second or two with the 74.4 hertz tone, and then it turns it on for 10 minutes. UVSQ Sat is a relatively new satellite built by a group in France. It's on a strict schedule. It hasn't been on in almost 2 months, but it gets turned on periodically for ham use. And we have other satellites, single sideband CW, and there's even a small group that can run FT4 through a few of our other satellites, using the FT4 software along with other software to adjust the frequencies that you're transmitting and receiving on. I don't do FT4, but there are others who do and enjoy that. FT4 is better suited for satellites than something like FT8 because of the shorter transmission times. FT8 is at 15 seconds. That's a little long. FT4 can, doesn't transmit for nearly as long. To use our satellites, you have to know when they're passing overhead. It's all predictable. It's a lot easier now than in years past where we would listen to W1AW bulletins to get the details to calculate when the satellites are available. There are websites, apps on mobile phones and tablets. For example, on this phone, I've got ISS Detector Pro, which is available on Android and the iOS devices. The Pro version costs a couple dollars more and allows you to track satellites besides the International Space Station. The free version of ISS Detector only handles the ISS. Another tracking app I use, again, this one's an Android phone, and it's AMSAT Droid Free. And like the name says, it's free. It's a basic tracking program. It puts a crosshairs on your screen. The top is north, the bottom is south, and draws a yellow line to show where the satellite is during a pass. And there are lots of apps. If you search the app stores for the different platforms for satellite tracking, there's a fair number of free programs, free apps. Others will cost a little, but at least try the free ones out before putting some money down, just to make sure the free one might do the job for you. And software on computers, different packages for Windows, Macs, Linux. Some of the software will go as far as controlling the radios to do frequency adjustments to compensate for Doppler and even control antenna rotators. Popular programs for Windows, it's SAT PC32 is probably the most popular one. Mac OS 10, there's Mac Doppler, and there's an open source program called gPredict that works with all three platforms and others. You can get the source code and compile it. Any questions? I'm not reading the chat window while I'm talking, but if you have questions, somebody can interrupt me and I'll be happy to answer, as well as answer questions at the end of the presentation. Move on. When you know when the satellites are coming overhead, you have the tracking app running.
We did have a question here in the
room.
room.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead with the question.
How helpful is the AMSAT.org website in helping you predict when the satellites are going overhead and their availability?
The AMSAT website has a tracking utility. You can plug in either your latitude and longitude or grid locator and then select the satellite, and it'll provide pass times, up to 50 pass times out in the future from the moment you initiate the search. It's useful. It doesn't, you can get a graphical view of where the satellite is in orbit, but it doesn't show, when I bring this, it doesn't have any, it doesn't have an easy way to have something like this where that yellow line on the right side of the display is where the satellite will be going across the sky. There is a map you can bring up. You could have that up in real time and see something like that, but the satellite track superimposed on a map of the world, where this is it's pretty much, think compass headings, and in this case the satellite will be going across the eastern and southeastern sky. But it is a useful tool. If nothing else, you can compare it with predictions you see from your software or your apps or other sources to make sure everything's singing from the same songbook, that all the programs are showing the same results.
And then do you have a go-to app or a go-to couple of apps that you use personally?
That's what I've been showing: AMSAT Droid Free and ISS Detector Pro. I could put ISS Detector Pro on an iPhone or an iPod. I like the simplicity of AMSAT Droid Free. ISS Detector has a little more graphics to it. It's a decent program. I think it was like $2 something on the Google Play Store to get the Pro version. And I think for me, it's money well spent. And then I have two sources. As long as I update the Keplerian elements, I'll see the same results on both programs.
Okay, great. Thanks. I don't think there's anything else from the room.
Okay, well, I'll continue on. Once you know when the satellites are coming by, before you transmit, the general rule is if you don't hear the satellite, don't transmit. The simple reason is, even though some of our satellites are these 4-inch cubes, they have very good receivers built into them. Their transmitters may not be very strong. Like I said, AO91 transmits around 500 milliwatts, give or take. A 4 or 5 watt signal from a handheld radio pointed toward the satellite will be heard through the satellite. And if you're transmitting and you can't hear the satellite, you might be interfering with others who are hearing the satellite and are trying to make a contact. Now, the exception would be if you have to turn on the 10-minute timer on the SO50 satellite, which many times out west we do that. We'll turn it on even here in Arizona, but certainly along the West Coast. And then 10 minutes into the pass, we may have to shoot the 74.4 hertz tone at the satellite one more time before it goes out of range for us and before it goes across the East Coast. In terms of hearing the satellite, just open squelch all the way. Generally, our satellites will not break squelch. The ISS repeater might, but in most cases, the only way our satellites will break the squelch is if it's right over you, meaning it's at its closest point to you. Make sure to use the tone on the uplink when you're transmitting if needed, and be ready to twist the antenna. It's not just a matter of pointing the antenna at the satellite. The satellites tumble in their orbits. Their antennas will not stay vertical or horizontal like the antennas on your repeaters that are mounted vertically. Sometimes the best way to hear the satellite is you'll have to twist the antenna toward horizontal and be ready to twist it back toward vertical as the pass progresses. With practice, that becomes second nature, but that is something that might confuse you at first because you're hearing the satellite and all of a sudden you're not, or over a period of a few seconds it fades out, but it will fade back in during the pass a few times.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So what's the antenna on the satellite itself is omnidirectional?
On our satellites, they're typically omnidirectional. Some of them are circularly polarized. In the case of AO91, it has two simple whips. One is a 6-inch whip off one side of the satellite, and the opposite side has a 19-inch whip. The 6-inch whip on AO91 is the uplink receiver hearing our signals. And then the 19-inch whip is one side of a dipole for the 2-meter downlink. The satellite frame and the 6-inch whip make up the other side of the dipole. And the signals, you can generally get, better signals on the ground for the same transmitter power on lower bands compared to higher bands. AO91 with the squelch open, you could probably hear it on many passes just on a standard ducky antenna. A longer antenna or directional antenna, of course, will improve the situation.
Does the satellite tumble as it orbits?
It does. Our satellites have some stabilization mechanisms in them, but it's not like a direct TV or dish network, those sorts of satellites, the commercial communication satellites that are highly stable. In the case of the TV, satellite TV receivers, you just mount the antenna and leave it. You don't have to move the antenna to track the satellite. That's a factor of it being in a geostationary orbit, but you can just mount the antenna and forget it. It's always going to transmit a certain way that you'll receive, subject to weather conditions.
Okay, thanks.
All right. I mentioned the Doppler effect. The classic example is listen to the train whistle as the train goes by. As our satellites move in orbit, the frequencies, to and from the satellite will appear to change. Even though we're transmitting on one frequency, the satellite will transmit on another. This effect is, for our low orbit satellites, there's a small effect at 2 meters. It's usually about 3 kilohertz plus or minus. And in FM, the FM receivers can handle a little bit of Doppler without having to retune the radio. And in the case of the satellite, the frequencies are fixed. There's no retuning there. On the higher bands, we have to compensate on the ground because the satellite is only transmitting on a fixed frequency, which will appear to change as the satellite passes overhead. Simple rule for tuning for Doppler is we will tune up for our uplinks where we're transmitting and tune down for the downlinks where we're receiving. I didn't come up with that, but that is an easy way to remember. If you have to do frequency adjustments, that's how you would do them. Once you get set up, when the satellite's coming by. In my case, I grab a radio and an antenna and run out in the front yard and have neighbors point at me and ask me if I'm talking to the space aliens, or even the police come by and they'll occasionally ask me who I'm talking to this time. But in terms of making, contacts, at first just listen. Just listen for a little bit. You can get familiar with how the exchanges are done. They are typically rapid fire on the FM satellites because we're all trying to talk through a single channel repeater that covers, potentially can cover coast to coast. Lots of stations are trying to make their contacts, but at least listen to see who's getting through, and you get an idea of the of how it's done. Again, on FM satellites, there's no need to call CQ. You can just give your call sign, maybe your grid locator, or you might mention what city you're in. That would be sufficient to let people know, where you are. If you're on other satellites using single sideband or CW, it is encouraged to call CQ. It's just like on HF, you want people to find you and give you a call. The best thing, rather than just announcing yourself over and over and over on satellite, is listen and call somebody you hear, because then that signals to other operators that you're listening to the downlink. You're obviously hearing the satellite if you can recognize a call sign and make a call to a station you've heard. And chances are, if you're just starting out and you make one contact, others will start calling you. It'll be like fresh meat. Everybody's going to swarm to you, and you'll make a few contacts once you get on. Be ready to follow the satellite as it moves across the sky. I was trying to hold my elk log periodic. It doesn't show up well on this camera, but per the tracking app, I would have this nearby, either setting on on my trash bin or on the car, or I'll get one of those straps that people will put their phone or their iPod on their upper arm when jogging or working out. I'll put the strap down by my wrist where I'm holding the radio or a microphone so that I can see the tracking app easily while I'm doing something with the radio, and then know which, make sure I point my antenna the right way toward the satellite. And be ready to twist too, because the satellite's moving around, and vertical is not always the best orientation for the antenna. And whenever possible, work full duplex. That way you're hearing the satellite while you're transmitting, and you're getting through. You're not having to make blind calls and hope somebody heard you and calls you back. Unlike on HF, well, I suppose there are situations where you might be able to hear yourself, a long delayed echo. But with the satellite, it's almost instantaneous. It's almost like a phone call. You are able to hear yourself while you're transmitting, and then you're getting through. In my operating, my hands are usually full, either holding the radio in one hand, antenna in the other, or I'm holding the antenna, but I'm using my other hand to manipulate a radio, or maybe that tablet if I'm using the software-defined receiver. I'm not writing anything down. And after more than a couple of contacts, I may not remember every station that I've worked on a pass in a 10 to 20 minute span. So find it. What I like to do when I'm operating is I'll rig up an audio recorder. It can be a little recorder you buy at Target, Walmart, Amazon, any number of brands. I like the Sony recorders. I've used them for many years, and record at least my voice, if not have it have the recorder patched into the speaker on the radio, on the receive radio, and capture the satellite audio. And then I can play that back and hear everything that transpired, or I can just put the recorder in a short pocket, for example. And as long as I say the call sign of the other station, for each contact, I can just use that to be able to make my log entries. Many logging programs have support for satellite activity. You may have to enable it, or it's hidden in a menu to pop open a screen or a window to put in the particulars of the satellite you were using. Logbook of the World, QRZ Logger, EQSL. Satellite operators use those to upload their logs. Many people are using electronic confirmations instead of printing and mailing out lots of cards, but satellite operators still do that. In fact, there are some operators who go out of their way to get old stamps. And I'll show you an envelope of one of these. This ham in Florida, he goes online and he's bought all these old stamps. These are all space themed stamps from the, I guess from the 50s into the 70s. He put enough of them on to pay current postage, and sends them out to other hams. I'm happy with using one of the forever stamps. If I'm answering a QSL request, or I've put my logs into Logbook of the World, and people can get their confirmations that way without having to deal with paper. I think I skipped through a little fast there. How are we doing? And any questions, comments, daggers, arrows?
I was just going to make one comment here.
Sure.
What about SSTV, specifically from the ISS? Have you talked about that?
I can talk about that briefly. It's a good place to do that. The Russian side of the space station is, periodically they transmit a series of pictures using slow scan TV. They will typically transmit on 2 meters at 145.800 megahertz from the radio in the Russian service module, or Zarya. You can use freely available SSTV software on computers or even the mobile phones and tablets to decode those transmissions. I've used in the past Robot 36 on my phone. In fact, I did this once at a demonstration in Yuma think it was in 2020, there was a slow scan TV event taking place. So I went outside with my radio and antenna. I put the radio on, clipped the radio on my belt. I held the antenna. And what I did with the phone is I brought up the Robot 36 app and just held the phone's microphone next to the speaker on my radio. And I just held it and pointed it up so people could take a look at it. And I was decoding pictures in real time from outside the hall at the Hamfest. I also had the radio set to record, so I was also recording those transmissions that I could play back later on the phone app, or I could copy them to a computer and decode them. The Russians love doing slow scan TV. I think they're doing a 2-day slow scan TV experiment next week on the passes that favor Moscow, but there are other events that are intended for a worldwide audience that all of us in the Western US can take advantage of. And the Russians love their history, especially their space history. If you want your fill of Yuri Gagarin, many of their slow scan TV events feature lots of pictures of the Soviet and Russian space program.
Yeah, I did see on ariss-sstv.blogspot.com, the announcement today says that June 8th and 9th, they'll be doing those slow scan transmissions. Doesn't specifically say that it favors Russia, but it's going to be going for about 20 hours, 25 hours, it looks like. So
well, I thought
might be
it
able to
was.
get it.
I thought it was going to be one of the, and I'm bringing it up, on Twitter. And it probably won't show very well here, but the MAI SSTV experiments. MAI is Moscow Aviation Institute. When those SSTV events take place, those are usually done on the passes that favor Moscow. Moscow is far enough north where they might get, 5 or 6 passes, consecutive passes where they can get lots of pictures. But they tend to shut off the SSTV by the time those passes are over the Western US. If you're on the East Coast, you might get the tail end of each day's transmissions.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Again, I don't have a station at home, not even for HF. So portable operating is what I do, whether I'm at home or away, and it can be done with a handheld radio and a directional antenna. Some people, they stay with that because it works and they don't have to spend any more money on radios and antennas. Like all of you in San Diego, the HRO store here in Phoenix would be more than happy to have me walk in and say, I want to buy an IC 9700. There's about $1,400. I want to buy some antennas. There's another few $100s, and an azimuth elevation rotator for those antennas. That's more $100 bills going across the counter. You can do that, and the stores are happy to take your money, but you don't have to spend the money unless you choose to. Portable stations, with practice, portable stations can be just as effective as home stations. You can get to the point where people don't even realize that you're operating portable. And operating, in a portable manner, you can go to what would be considered rare locations, and there are some locations considered rare on the satellites that you'd only have to go an hour or maybe a couple of hours. The POTA and SOTA guys have a good handle on that, and then throw in satellite operating like 6 meters and other VHF, UHF operating grid locators. You can get away from San Diego like I can get away from Phoenix and be in a grid locator where there are few or no resident hams and make yourself the center of attention working satellites. But in my own experience, it seemed like not many were doing that until the National Parks on the Air event, the ARRL event in 2016. Satellite operators started showing up from parks during the NPOTA year. I operated from some here in Arizona, Lake Mead National Recreation Area in Las Vegas, and from a couple of park sites around the Bay Area during PacificCon that year. Since 2016, after the NPOTA event ended, satellite operators started looking at summits on the air, parks on the air, which isn't specific for U.S. national parks, and other sorts of on the air events, to be able to get out and operate. And this isn't limited to just getting out here in the U.S. Our equipment, handheld radios, antennas that can be broken down and put in a bag. In my case, other than the antenna, this old laptop bag, this is my satellite station. I carry it on planes. It goes in the trunk of my car. I've taken it to Canada. When U.S. hams could get permits down in Mexico about a decade or so ago, I would operate from northern Baja California. Licensing issues aside, there are other reasons I don't go down to northern Baja anymore. But 2008, 2009, you could still drive down towards San Felipe, and there were lots of places you could operate and be in demand on satellites. Customs requirements, usually it's just a matter of being ready to tell customs at a border crossing what you have and that you're an amateur radio operator, and bring the official copy of your license along, and just be ready for, it's not just law enforcement, but I've had my share of encounters with law enforcement operating across the US and once in a Canadian national park. Ironically, my trips to Mexico in 2009 and 10 with my satellite station, I was never questioned by the Mexican police or military. If anything, they just waved at me and would drive by. But of course, like with anything we do out in the field, you have a little situational awareness, or what used to be simply called common sense. There might be times where it's just not wise to set up and use your radios, even here in Arizona or in California. First time I tried this, I started working satellites near the end of 2005. I went to Dayton the next year in 2006. I didn't bring a directional antenna. I just brought, where is it? I just brought this old ICOM ICW32. This is about 20 years old now. And I put a long telescoping whip on it. And I was able to work AO51 along with SO50 that were available at that time. I operated from the Hamvention site out in Swap area and other places around Dayton. And this really cemented my enjoyment and interest in doing this. Since I could bring a fully functional station along and be relatively successful, I didn't need big antennas or big radios for that matter. Last December, I drove over to Long Beach, met up with my friend NDAF N6UTC, and we went up to this town called Trona, which is out near Ridgecrest, up on the edge of the Mojave Desert. It's a nice place to go if you don't want your mobile phone to work. I couldn't even get a signal enough to make an emergency call out there. But NDAF and we operated on a grid line along the road out there in Delta Mike 15 and 16. NDAF did most of the operating, but I did get on the air and even made a contact with NDAF. I walked about 20 yards away from him and we talked through the AO91 satellite that was about 400 miles or so overhead. NDAF wanted to confirm a contact with that location, so I came along, and it was an enjoyable day. It's an example of just getting away from Los Angeles to a spot where I think there are a couple satellite hams that live in Delta Mike 15, closer toward LA, and not in Delta Mike 16. After Christmas, the next month, I made one of my periodic voyages to the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. For those who work 6 meters, you'll probably recognize this location because it's the one small part of the grid Delta Mike 31 that extends into the US. right at the Mexican border. Most of Delta Mike 3.1 is in Mexico, and right now U.S. hams are unable to get a license unless you become a Mexican citizen and go through their interesting licensing process now. But I drove down to Oregon Pipe. It was a cloudy morning there, and the radio's sitting behind me on the roof of the car. On the left are my 2 radios for single sideband satellites, the FT817 and the ICOM ICR30, along with the ICOM ID 5100 for FM, and the elk antenna is just laying back there. And like during the National Parks on the Air, I walked to the visitor center that's behind me in the picture and got a stamp to confirm I was at the National Monument on January 22nd. Going back to my friend NDEF and N6UTC, a couple years ago, just before COVID, I was over in Los Angeles. NDEF and I were doing satellite demonstrations on the Queen Mary in the Port of Long Beach. And after that event, we drove up toward the town of Mojave, next to Edwards Air Force Base, and we wanted to drive out to a 4-grid intersection that's out there for grids Delta Mike 04, 05, 14, and 15. It's just off Highway 58 east of Mojave. I was surprised that I could drive my 4-door sedan with not much ground clearance out to the 4-grid intersection. I didn't have to hike very far if I had driven my car. We drove very close to the 4-grid intersection, close enough where I could put my THD-74 running APRS to transmit our location. That 4-grid intersection is at 35 degrees north, 118 degrees west exactly. We were able to show up on the APRS map so people would know where we were operating from. And for our own benefit, NDAF had a GPS receiver, and we found the spot, and that's where we set up a radio we used out there. We were alternating, working different passes. He marked the spot and then put his radio on a small folding table, and this was a picture of me working the AO91 satellite on one of the passes. I want to say this was a pass that went coast to coast, and there were a lot of people who were calling both of us at different times, trying to make contact with 4 different grids simultaneously. It was a cool day out there, a windy day, so we never took windbreakers off while we were out there. Otherwise, it was a nice day. And probably an extreme example of satellite operating. A couple years ago, satellite operators hatched this idea of operating from parking lots at Walmart stores. Walmart stores are everywhere. Many of them, if you have an RV, you can park overnight in. And a couple of hams had been traveling, and they would stop at Walmart parking lots to work satellites because of the big parking lots. They're usually in open areas, so they could get on the air quickly and not have to deal with being out in the country where there might be trees or other obstructions that would make satellite operating harder. In 2018, for the first Walmart parking lot on the air event, I used the Walmart store locator to figure out where the stores were here in the Phoenix area, and I made a plan to work a few hours driving from one Walmart to another. Near the center of the map, there's a 2515. That's a store that's actually on a grid line that runs through Phoenix, dividing grids Delta Mike 3.3 and Delta Mike 4.3. I started there and packed my gear up and got out of there because I didn't want to stay in that neighborhood very long, and then proceeded to go north to work a couple more stores in North Phoenix, and then got on a freeway to go around to a couple of stores in Scottsdale before ending up in Mesa. And knowing when the satellites were passing by, I could figure out how far I wanted to drive and still be ready for the next pass. And in this case, I worked one pass from each of these 8 stores, and apparently I had done more. I'd made more contacts from more stores than anybody else in the 2018 event. And it wasn't a real formal event. It was actually a social media invention. And then coming up with rules. There are all sorts of rules, not just making contacts, but running into the Walmart, getting some food to eat inside the Walmart, or going inside the store and buying the components to make an antenna and actually use that antenna on a satellite. I didn't do those things at first. I was just interested in operating, and I met my goals, but others really went into the getting the meal inside the store or building the antenna. The next year, I looked to go to more stores, and I ended up going to 14 different stores in the southeast part of the Phoenix metropolitan area. Again, using the store locator and looking at satellite pass times, I was able to start near the center of this map, which is in the suburb of Mesa. And the first few stops are separated by only a couple of miles. So I could do a short drive, get on another pass, make contacts, get back in the car, drive a little further, get on another pass. And some of the passes, there was more time in between them, so I could drive further. But I ended up, I think I started, it was about 8:30 in the morning at the first store in Mesa. And it was almost 7 p.m. It was approaching sunset, where I went to a Walmart store that also had a Sam's Club next to it, one of the few that's left in Phoenix, to finish up my operating. And I used FM, single sideband, and even made a packet contact at the first store I started at in this 10-hour span. With that, I'd be happy to answer questions, take comments. Thank you to everyone who was involved in inviting me to talk here this evening. And maybe in a few months or maybe next year, I can do a different presentation in person and throw in a demonstration at the same time. And I will turn off the screen sharing.
So I have a comment. So the only thing seems like you haven't done is had a driver in a car with a sunroof with the antenna sticking out the sunroof and making contacts while you're moving.
No, I haven't had that. Although one trip a couple of years ago to Los Angeles, I hooked up a handheld radio to a dual band whip that I have on the trunk of my car, and I listened to a pass, and I figured, okay, if I can hear the satellite, let me see if others can hear me. And I did make about 3 or 4 contacts doing, for the benefit of CHP, I'll say 70 miles an hour through Desert Center on I-10. I think I was doing a little faster. I had my recorder with me. I didn't have it patched into the radio, but I just hit record on it, so I wouldn't have to even think of writing things down while driving. I just didn't want to stop in Desert Center. I could have stopped and operated, but I was trying to make the drive across the desert, without making lots of stops and turning what would be a 5.5 to 6 hour drive into 8 or 9 or 10.
Yep.
I do see Phil's question. Can we get copies of my slides? Just tell, I was dealing with Chris, but I will be happy to send a PDF of my slideshow to whoever wants it. You can either contact me, or I can use this board at palomararc.org or some other address to forward it out there.
Yeah, if you can send it to board, we will get it on the website and get a link to it in next month's scope.
Okay, I'll do that when we're done here.
Okay.
Now the PDF is about 3 megabytes in size, so it should go through the email just fine. The PowerPoint's a bit larger with the pictures, and the PDF, most everybody can see a PDF even in a web browser now.
Yeah, I think either way is fine.
Okay.
Any questions or comments from the room for him? No?
I was going to say that hi, this is John W6XM, is a sometime VHF rover.
Mhm.
That Walmart packet, or the Walmart parking lots on the air, you have my respect. That's a heck of an op, and I chuckled watching the map. So thank you for showing that.
Well, there were people who they may not have gone to as many stores, but they did more of the other things that were built into this convoluted rule set. Rules developed by a large committee. You would get bonus points if you operated sitting in a cart. You would get bonus points if you helped round up some carts and put them into a cart corral. Did you have your dog with you? Did you go inside and buy the Old Roy Walmart brand dog snacks, for your dog? Were you on a grid boundary that just happened to go through the Walmart parking lot, or were you within a half mile or so of that? There were the easiest way to explain it is, it was just a whole lot of fun. And then people started asking the satellite guys, are you going to do this on HF? The response was something like, yeah, go ahead and set it up. We'll join you. I wrote an article about this for the AMSAT Journal for the first Walmart parking lot event. And there's noise being made that another one will be attempted the first weekend in July, like July 2nd, 3rd, I think it is. WMPLOTA.org, I think hasn't been updated yet, but it's been turned back on. That's sort of like the ground zero for the rules and everything related to this event, using air quotes.
What you miss not being in the room is all of the chuckles when the Walmart parking lots came up, and when you're talking about all the whole room is just chuckling here. It's awesome.
Well, there are a couple guys who have done presentations here in the Phoenix area and in Southern California specifically on that. I had those slides in a presentation I gave at Hamcation in Orlando in February. And when I brought the first slide up, before I could say a word, the whole room was falling over with laughter. You think about it, but in all seriousness, when Walmarts are just about everywhere, and we were taking advantage of that fact. Now, some people would only go to one store nearby. There were a few who did like I did, went to several. And I think there was a guy in northern Mexico who went to a Walmart near him. There were no more Walmarts in Alaska, but a satellite operator up there went to the old sites, and the rules were, he got points for operating from former Walmart locations, in honor of him not being able to drive to a Walmart.
So are those now Spirit Halloween locations?
They might be seasonally, or they may just be, shells of shopping centers, just like when the Kmart store started closing. But the shopping carts, people would sit in a shopping cart, hold their antenna and radio. Sometimes they would have an assistant push the shopping cart or turn the shop. And so instead of moving the antenna in the operator's hand, the whole cart would be moved.
And I assume there are plenty of photos and videos of this out there to be had. So that's pretty neat. I'll have to look at that. Do you know when the next one is?
First weekend in July, I believe, is the target for the next attempt at it.
All right.
And I'm looking through the notes in the chat window. Portable rotation, yes, they used to be a company that made a small antenna rotator for satellite stations. I have not played with them. A friend of mine who was living up near LA now lives near Charlotte on the East Coast, was involved with portable rotation. Those were very good rotators. I guess when you're targeting a small section of an already small market, that would be satellite operators in the wider amateur radio community, they just couldn't keep that going for more than a few years. There are some designs for lightweight rotators that would, handle a dual band Yagi or log periodic. I think it's called SARCnet, Sierra Alpha Romeo Charlie. There's an Australian group that designed this little rotator. I think you could even use a 3D printer to make some of the parts, and interface it to software on a computer. I don't, one of these days I'm going to set up a semi-permanent setup on a big tripod in my backyard for the antennas and bring the cables into the house where I can operate in air conditioning comfort, instead of having to run outside, work a pass, and then quickly run back in.
Well, so I was wondering, speaking of the automatic antenna aiming, they've got these telescope motorized mounts for them, and I was wondering if there's any way to program those, so like, strap your antenna to your telescope and have your telescope track whatever you're tracking.
I don't have a simple answer, an absolute answer to that. I believe there are people who have used telescope mounts that way, either with computer control, or at least they'll mount the antenna on the telescope mount. And some of those mounts will allow you to flip the, the antenna that's mounted on there 90 degrees. So that's roughly equivalent to twisting the antenna. But I know a couple of people who are into astronomy who have, they've talked about doing that sort of thing with a telescope mount instead of going something amateur radio specific, like an antenna rotator.
Okay. All right. Anything else from the room or from the group online? Fantastic presentation, very informative and amusing. I think there may be some extra contacts on Walmart's on the air. And I wanted to add one more thing about the ISS slow scan TV. We did that at a CERT meeting, Community Emergency Response Team meeting in Oceanside a couple of years ago before the pandemic. And, we just, like you said, just stepped outside with the radio and the phone, and we didn't even have any Yagis. We were just using the rubber duckies on the HTs and got the images just fine. And it was all sorts of fun.
I don't know what power levels the Russians use on the radio on their side of the station for the slow scan TV, since it's usually something like 3 minutes on and a couple minutes off. They may run, more than 5 watts that's used on the crossband repeater. When packets on, that's usually run at 10 watts. They may run 25 watts off that. Now that the Russians have the same radio with the customized firmware that's in the European Columbus lab, I believe there is a slow scan TV mode built into that firmware, and that's what's supposed to run the next slow scan event next week, the one that we probably won't hear in the West. Did I overshoot your time?
Oh, no, you're fine. I was I got smartwatches with email notifications. Yeah, that's the drawback of smartwatches, is when you look at your watch to read an email, people are like, "You in a hurry? You need me to stop?" No. I see Kevin posted a link here in the chat. So everyone, make sure you take a look at that. School Amateur Radio Club Network.
Yeah, I read about that SARC SARC track antenna rotator project a few years ago. It was in an Australian ham magazine, and its interest has picked up around the world because it's something, in terms of an antenna rotator that will handle azimuth and elevation, so not just the compass heading, but how high above the horizon to point the antenna. There aren't a lot of options. Portable rotation in the past. Yaesu has the G5500 or 5500. That's not cheap. I think there's an Alpha Spid, and that's maybe not as expensive as the Yaesu, but certainly not on the the low end of the price range. And with 3D printing, there should be you would think there would be more options. At least for a lightweight setup, a dual handheld antenna mounted on one of these lightweight rotators.
Yeah. Mark has something.
Just a quick question. I have one of those arrow antennas,
Mm-hmm.
and it's pretty good, but you do have to, as you're going along, you got to kind of twist it and make sure.
Yeah.
So is there any advantage or disadvantage to using a helical, circular polarized?
For the most part, there's probably not much of an advantage now. You know, over the years, we've had some of our satellites using circularly polarized antennas. And in those cases, if you had a circular polarized antenna at the right polarization, you know, clockwise, you know, right hand or left hand circular, I mean, you could see a slight advantage. But, you know, when you get down to these 4-inch cubes that are using simple whips that, you know, come off the satellite frame, you're not going to see much, you know, if any advantage, probably no disadvantage. But for a lot of people, you know, building just a dual band Yagi or buying the dual band Yagi or log periodic that's not circularly polarized will be sufficient.
Well, I was just thinking that, not that you get any advantage. If you read a linear polarized source with a circular polarized antenna, you lose 3 dB. On
Right.
the other hand, there's no rotation, there's no horizontal or vertical, you just point it and go. So that's why I was asking if anybody's doing it.
In theory, that's correct, but when you consider that the satellite is moving around, even though you're dealing with circular polarization on the antennas, you could still sometimes end up with a little bit of fade you know, on the signals going up or down. But you know, there are people who have those antennas. Many of the larger antennas you could buy from places like M Squared, you know, if they don't come, you know, designed for circular polarization, they can be turned into circularly polarized antennas.
Yeah,
I'm not.
Mark says just build it.
Yeah, or you know, at 2 meters and 70 centimeters, building it is a great option. You know, who's going to build a 20-meter Yagi to put up above their house? I'm sure there are people who will do that, but you know, the antenna sizes when you get to VHF and UHF and, you know, the contesters, you know, go higher into the microwaves, you know, you can build big antennas with lots of gain. But for our satellites, you know, the handheld antennas that have a few dB of gain compared to using omnidirectional antennas, you don't need much to have a, you know, a very good antenna.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anything else? No? Online? All right.
If you ever build that system that goes into your house, you're gonna have to go get a Walmart shopping cart to set in your shack. We'll get you a Walmart shopping cart to sit in.
Well, I would probably just bring the cables in from my patio, you know, maybe onto my dining room table and just set up or put a little, you know, a little table in the dining room where I can sit inside and not have to worry about it. Because the whole idea, I'm not going to set up the shopping cart in the house, and I'm trying to get out from being, you know, get away from being outside the house when it's 100 and something, you know, in the summertime. But I could do that. You know, I wouldn't have to put the antennas up very high off the ground, just a few feet, and to be able to clear the rooftops of my neighbors' houses.
If there's no rule that says where the shopping cart has to be, just set in it in your house.
Well, no, there is a rule. It has to be in a parking lot of a Walmart or a phone.
Yeah, you have to. And there are some rules. You have to be in a parking lot within sight of the store. And there were bonuses if you could, you know, take a picture showing that you were in the parking lot and you could see the Walmart sign on the building along with the American flag, or if you're in Canada, the Canadian flag in front of the store. Like I said, lots of interesting rules that went with that unusual event.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I have one more piece of business as we say thank you for this awesome presentation. And that is field day. I forgot to mention this earlier. Whoops, what do you, oh, thank you. So I believe I'm sharing the right thing now. Of course, I've got other things over it. Okay, so field day. Palomar is not running our own field day this year, just due to lack of the uncertainty of what is going to be happening around field day, who's going to be available to operate. The last time we ran a field day, the operator schedule was pretty sparse. Maybe we were running too many stations, but this year we're just encouraging people to go out and be active at a field day. There are several still happening in the area. And if you go to arrl.org/field-day-locator that I have up here on the, well, I have it on the screen that's sharing for them.
Okay.
Hopefully that still is sharing for them. Yes, it is. Okay. So field day locator, and of course it auto finds you in Connecticut for some reason. So at any rate, you can easily find your location for field days in the area, and just put in Oceanside. And yeah, so plenty of options around the area. So yeah, there's looks like okay, yeah. So Poway, is that Valley Center? Where is that? Escondido, okay. And Ramona. Is anything happening in Valley Center? No, okay. So yeah, there's 3 options around the area. Get out, operate. If you don't want to go to a site, feel free to operate at from your QTH or from wherever you want to. You can operate as your own call sign, or you can operate as W6NWG and get the club some points, even though we're not doing a full field day ourselves. Those are still within the rules this year. All right. Thank you, everybody. If there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and end the meeting here at right at 21:01.
Thank you, Joe, and everyone there.
All right.